everyone. Hi.
Hey.
Last session, third day. Yeah?
Yeah.
We're pumped. Thank you for having us. And let's all make sure we're in the right place. We're here to talk about intentionally designed inclusive educational spaces, navigating intersectionality, allyship, and belonging. Is this a new concept for any of you in these 3 days that you've been here? Hope not. Hope not. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Janelle Mercado, and I am the project coordinator from Supporting Inclusive Practices out of El Dorado County Office of Education, and my co-presenter.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kevin Schaefer. I'm the director of the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project. Although I'm the director, Janelle is the boss.
Agreed.
Just so you know.
True story. True story. We just make sure he's in the right place at the right time.
I just show up.
There you go. Raise your hand if you've heard of Supporting Inclusive Practices Project. Okay, so a few of you familiar with our work. Well, today we have a very short amount of time with you. You're gonna have to kick us out. We just love this work and we love talking. So we'll try to fit it in the short amount of time we have. But we hope that you leave today with an abundance of resources and know how to contact us if needed in the future. To get us started, if you didn't already download our resources from the app, you can access the slide deck at this link here or using the QR code. And it's also on the next slide. I want to make sure all of you know what our project is and the work that we do. So we are a technical assistance project that's funded by the Department of Ed out of El Dorado and Riverside County Offices of Education. But fun fact, we don't just stay in those two county offices. We travel across the state of California in helping school districts, county offices, SELPAs in their pursuit of either designing or redesigning their inclusive schools. So we really truly live by our mission and vision, and it is that every student in this state will be educated in an environment that's intentionally designed, equitable, and inclusive. Give me a thumbs up if you're down for that mission, if you're here for that reason. Awesome. So we innovate, we include, we impact. We're at conferences, and some of our real deep level work is we have now over 96 school districts and county offices and SELPAs in this state that we work with. So we have program specialists from the far north to the far south that support the deep dive into this work. So you can see that our model is designed around a 3-tiered approach. Tier 1 is anything that you all can access. If your district or your county office is not currently a SIP grantee, on our website, our social media. How many of you follow us on social media? A few of you. All right. Kevin's the voice behind the social media. If you are a social media user, follow us at SIP Inclusion on all of the different handles, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. We also have a podcast that's on our website along with a ton of archived webinars. So we contract with national and international presenters around all things inclusion. You can access those for free on our website. Our Tier 2 support is, like I said, all of the county offices and districts that we're currently working with at a really deep level. And then Tier 3 is everything in partnership with the Department of Ed and supporting those school districts who have the highest needs around compliance and improving their systems to ensure that they are creating programs that are accessible and equitable for students with disabilities. Okay? So what are we going to do today? What are our outcomes for this short time? We're going to do some reflection. We want you to think about and understand where your mindsets are around inclusion and understanding what it means to create environments where students with disabilities have the rightful presence and they are centered in all of the work that we're doing, okay? That is one aspect of our conversation today. We're gonna look at what our biases or our thoughts or our thinking is around disability as it relates to ableist systems that we know exist and have created disproportionate outcomes for students with disabilities. And then we're also going to dig into some resources and some ideas that we have to support you with how to be an ally for students with disabilities. You look like you wanted to add something.
Nope.
That microphone was going like this, so sure. So to begin and ground us in this space, we like to center the voices of the disability community. And one of our, well, she is the leader in the work of disability rights. It's Judy Human, who we had the honor of working with before her passing at one of our conferences. But we love this quote to center our conversations. It says, we have to have the ability to make decisions about ourselves, to not be led by others, but to truly have our voices heard. And that is what we continuously see surface from the disability community. Nothing about us without us. We want to be at the conversation. We want to make decisions. That is what we are hearing from the disability community. So we, as educators, have the power and the privilege to center the voices of the disability community. We would love to know what surfaced for you, what connections, questions, thought bubbles came up for you. Yeah.
I'm gonna be brave to ask the question, and it's just in private conversations, I'm feeling that a lot of people have the same question, but it's a scary one to ask.
Okay.
So my question is this: are there some students where a smaller environment is necessary?
I'm going to repeat that for the online community. We want to make sure everyone's okay.
Oh, and at what point does it cross over from student needs into segregation? Not everybody, and again, maybe I'm wrong.
You're not.
But maybe not every student can thrive in a room with 35 people.
Okay, for the online community and for anyone who's on this side of the room, the question is, are there times in which a smaller, and make sure I get it right, smaller group setting is more appropriate for some students? Yeah, that's part one. And then part two, and at what point does that move into segregation? Okay, so we could probably spend this whole session talking about it. I'm going to start and then yeah. So first of all, there is a continuum of supports and services for a reason, because it is absolutely the case in which there are times a student may require have different needs that require something specialized, that it is more appropriate to be in another space. But a couple things here. One, special education is not a place. It is a service, okay? So how we approach that, it's very, very important that we approach that intentionally. And I'm gonna go real quick into like the history of how we got to where we are. And it is very common that we approach that through the lens of program versus need. Okay, so are we trying to meet the needs of a child because we have a program that a child then receives services through, or are we trying to meet the needs of a child innovatively because our system was designed very separate? And it is very common that when we run out of options or we don't know what to do, we send a child over there. Okay, so that's the first question. And sometimes that requires dismantling our current systems in order to start redesigning. Okay, I know you have a different probably approach to that too.
Not different, just additional.
Just additional.
So we could literally stop with the slideshow and talk about this the rest of the 75 minutes. And I think it's a really important discussion because we overuse the term inclusion such that it has lost its meaning. We also define inclusion as students being in a place. And what we're going to be talking about today is defining inclusion separate from least restrictive environment through a compliance lens, moving students into a place with their general ed peers. Inclusion is actually the sense of connection, community, relationship, and belonging a student feels in a particular place. So is it possible, so I'm going to throw a question back to you. Is it possible for a student in a general education setting, the most least restrictive environment, is it possible for a student in that place to not experience meaningful inclusion? Is it possible for a student who is in a self-contained environment to feel a sense of belonging? Okay, so we have to look at what is the definite, what is the term we're using? Is it least restrictive environment, compliance, place, integrated with an idea of inclusion? Because we make decisions, think about an IEP meeting, we make a decision to have X percentage of access to their typically developing peers and off they go. If that setting is not designed in such a way that the teacher is trained, the teacher has the resources, the knowledge, it's not going to be inclusive. Here's the rub. Students who are in self-contained environments, think about post-secondary, they are in artificial settings with typical like disabled peers. Too often, generalization. In that artificial setting, at what point, getting to your second question, at what point are we providing authentic experiences for students with disabilities such that they are learning those skills that are going to be required when they get a job or go to college? And a lot of times that's what's missing. The one quote, early segregation, students in preschool are segregated. They're in those segregated environments all the way through post-secondary. And then we expect them to be successful when they leave our system. Some of our districts, they have provided all students with disabilities a place on the general education roster. General ed teacher. That student might not be in that class 75% of the time, but they have a place and they have a connection.
And they have the opportunity. That's where it comes back through that potential redesign, because it's too often where we're making those decisions based on the program that's already been built versus a more fluid process where that classroom, because every student, when they have an IEP, they're still a general education student first, right? And so by removing them from that roster, that's like the process here, right? We're tackling this from both mindset and process. When they're removed from that roster, now we have a whole different trajectory of decision-making and assignments. Are we even providing that opportunity anymore?
Did that answer your question? Sure. Okay, because we're going to go deeper into that, actually.
The district, like all needs, when I'm thinking about students that have some pretty significant needs and might need a modified setting, all except that, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We're not trying to silo students. I got it. It's
Yeah.
the intention.
And it always goes back to the need of the child versus, are we designing systems that meet the needs of the program and the staff and the policies and the practices?
And is it a question of the student not being able or ready to be successful in that general education setting? Or could it be that the system hasn't provided the knowledge, the resources, the communication pathways, the involvement of general education teachers to be effective in that environment? So we blame the student when it's actually the system that is not creating those environments and those circumstances for inclusion to be successful. And then our experience with inclusion is that it doesn't work. And then that becomes our belief system.
And I see a question and 3 questions, 4 questions. We could just ditch the whole slide deck, Kevin. At this point, it's totally fine. But also I have a question for all of you. And I'm gonna get to those questions. How many of you hear this question or hear this statement? The student isn't ready to be included. Raise your hand if that is common language used. The belief system behind that is what? It's a student problem. They can't. We don't believe that it is possible. There's a lot of beliefs behind that. So you'll see in the work that we do, one of the starting places when we work with districts is the topic of our conversation today. It's addressing and reflecting on our beliefs, our mindsets, and what really we have been taught to do. Make sure I get this right, that it's interesting how there are programs and certain spaces where we have designed inclusive programming, where if that student was to go down the street, they would be experiencing something completely different. But we see that when we create it, it works and it's possible. Did that summarize it without like, okay. And I think there was a question in the online space, maybe, and then I see here. Oh, great.
One of them said, I am different, not less, right? It's power. That one is powerful.
Yeah, I am different, not less. Yeah. There's a question here. Yeah.
That was gone to, well, what about everyone else's impact that their teacher has on the rest of the class? Because if I take care of just the one, then what about what everyone else is doing?
Yeah.
How do we respond?
So one approach, and I would say that there is no textbook response to any of this. Oh, repeat the question. How do we respond when there is a belief or someone says something like, I have one or two children where there are more significant needs. How do I stop everything to address one or two student needs? Yeah. So one thing, and I would always say how you respond is going to be very dependent on the relationship you have with that person, what you know about the situation. But I think just helping people understand too that when we do center any student, whether we're talking about a student with a disability or not, any student who has needs and we plan for that, it's very interesting how what some students need is often really beneficial for many students. And trying to like navigate that space first in understanding, well, let's talk about what the needs are. And then let's see how, like, who else might that benefit is one way to navigate that conversation.
I think of it also in terms of understanding the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. Yeah. If the language we use is centered on fixing the student, that's one approach. It's usually an ableist perspective, whereas the social model is looking at the environment and what the environment, how we can change the environment to provide more accessibility for the student, because then the student with the behavior is responding to the environment they're in. So really a starting point with that teacher is probably not the only one who has that same perspective, because their experiences with inclusion have probably shaped their beliefs to say it doesn't work. So then their actions, the language they use, is influenced by their experiences and their belief system. So one of the biggest barriers that we work with is the culture. And changing a culture is super difficult and takes time. Here's the rub. We don't talk about disability and ableism typically outside of special education. Even districts with a focus on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, students with disabilities too often are not considered as part of that conversation because it's seen as a special education responsibility. So
has that been your experience? Yeah.
We're creating that bifurcated system that starts with college programs and then all the way through. And that is probably the biggest barrier for inclusion, because a lot of times we want to focus on the thing that we're doing, the UDL, the co-teaching, the PBIS. But if we haven't actually addressed the culture and the mindset and the understanding, the lowered expectations for students with disabilities, all of the actions in the world are not going to make the change we want to see. Okay. We do have to get moving.
We do.
We're like halfway through. This is actually one of the quotes that's up around the room by Dr. Eric Harder. And it really addresses this idea that once students are placed in segregated environments, it's very rare that they come back into general education or more inclusive environments. And then we have to question what is available to students post-secondary. And that's our goal. There's a lot happening in California right now, post-secondary options. So one of them is, did you know that in the United States, I think there's 50 4-year university residential living programs for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So the students that are most segregated in our pre-K-12, students with autism, students with intellectual disabilities like Down syndrome, they now have an opportunity to go to a 4-year university in a fully inclusive program. California has one. It's in its 4th year at UC Davis, and it's called the Redwood Seed Scholars. Beth Foraker is the director. Look it up. Go on their website. It's awesome. They for the first time, they have in their 4 seniors. They've been there 4 years. She said, when the students come, it's their first time in a fully inclusive, authentic environment in their education at 19. They asked the question, what elective do you want to take? You can take any elective you want. Guess what their number one response is? Huh? Well, yeah, take a class. No, cooking. Do you have a cooking class? Because that's typically their workforce experience. That's year 1. Year 2, they are in entomology. They are in Hispanic women's studies. They have, at the age of 19, all of a sudden become self-determined and they can make their own decisions. Have to ask ourselves, is our programming for students with disabilities reflective of that opportunity? You see the connect that has to happen all the way through. There's more things happening. We have the alternative pathway to a diploma for students with extensive support needs can earn the same diploma as all other students, not a certificate of completion, which is actually a barrier for students to get a job. This requires some planning, though, at the high school level. It has to be aligned with the minimum requirements for graduation, course of study. We have to redesign our programs for students with extensive support needs in order to have that happen. We also have an IEP template that's coming out that is focused on student and family goals and visions and dreams for their lives, beginning in preschool. You are doing inclusion if you have a focus on student-centered, student-led IEPs, allowing input for students to actually design their own program. That's an approach. There was one more back.
Oh, it was the center.
Oh, yeah, I missed it. Did you also know that there's an RFA, a request for applications in California to begin the California Center for Inclusive Colleges? Every UC, every CSU now has the support and the funding by the governor to create similar programs. So that, in my mind, is a charge for all of us to figure out inclusive programs so students are prepared. Okay. So we're going to see a quick video. This is Sean Spence. He is actually on the leadership team for the California Transition Alliance. He's a mover, shaker in the policy making in California. All right, Janelle.
Just cutting him
I don't
off.
mind being cut off.
One of the biggest myths out there, I feel, is that all disabled are mentally indeficient. Some of the kids with disabilities like me can't hide that. They're there for the whole world to see.
For a lot of people, when they see us with a disability, especially with a physical disability, they think we have limitations, right? And in some ways, we do have limitations. For myself, I can do a few things better than a lot of people, and I can do a few things worse than a lot of people, right? Just like anyone else.
Well, like I was thinking that people with disabilities, mental disabilities, physical disabilities, that they'll never be able to do what a regular person can do. Because that's the one thing that everybody's always dealt with throughout their whole lives. They've always had experiences where somebody's going to tell you, oh, you're not good enough for this. You can't do that. You won't be able, you're not mentally able to do something. Right now, you see people in the disabled Olympics running and with the mechanical feet, and they run 100 meters or even more sometimes.
I would say that another myth is people only without disabilities go to college.
Like people don't think you could achieve it. Like they'll just think you'll just not being on their own. I always wanted to go to college, but I've always heard that people with disabilities don't go to college, and like students like with me, like they didn't really seem to care like what I, like if you were going to go to college or not. They like praise more of the AP students kind of. In the second grade, I had a teacher who told me that I should be institutionalized because she thought I was never gonna make it. It it was just gonna get harder and harder and harder. But my 3.57 GPA, I think it's proved that one out.
The mic drop moment, right? A couple things before we move into the next section that we have to, I'm speaking. A couple things that we have to self-reflect on is this work takes humility. We have to self-reflect on whether or not we actually understand the needs and the experiences of the disability community for whom we design without having a disability to understand deeply what that means. Critical. And as educators, we're used to being in the decision-making position. Do we have the humility to say, we don't know? An expert in special education does not mean we are experts in the needs and the environments that need to be created for the disability community. They're two completely separate ideas. Because you're an expert in special education compliance and programming does not mean you have deep understanding of disability and the experience. That's huge. The other thing that I want to say before we move into this next section is identity work, intersectionality work is also critical to this work. Because what happens too often that shapes our culture is we define students with disabilities by their disability, and it's through a deficit lens. Too often. It's a generalization, I understand. How many times have you heard that is a student with an IEP? That is a SPED kid. That is a county kid. When we use that language, we are othering and we are taking away all of the other beautiful qualities and characteristics of that student. So the ableism, the design of the environment, the culture, the mindset, that's where this work begins, and self-reflecting on our own bias.
And that is what our system was developed and rooted in, ableism. So going back again to that question of, but if it's just one or two students, how do I stop everything to meet their needs? That one or two students, absolutely, like every other student, deserves the opportunity. They have the right to receive an equitable education. And so it requires humility, it requires courage to start disrupting that. Does that mean you leave here today and you start correcting everybody? No, you're not going to make friends that way. But to address those conversations through some curiosity, I'm really curious as to why you think that or what your experience has been. Let's talk through this because we're all in this together, right? Like we all grew up in this system together, and especially like we all went to school, we had that experience. Okay.
So we talked a little bit about the difference between least restrictive environment and inclusive education. They're different, but our goal is to determine least restrictive environment, which is also an inclusive environment. Okay, it's not about the place. The other thing that I want to say before we move on is, does everybody have their pen, pencil, writing utensil, computer? Because what I'm about to say, you're going to want to copy down. It's going to be that deep and intellectual. All right. We focus on students with disabilities when we talk about inclusion. The benefits for the non-disabled students is also a critical consideration because when we create inclusive educational environments, we also create inclusive communities. And when you make that connection and relationship from a non-disabled student to a disabled student, you're actually creating allies and you're developing empathy within your typically developing students. It's twofold. We are denying our non-disabled students the dignity of empathy. Ooh.
Which mirrors community, society, workforce, our hope, right?
All right. So one of the starting places is how do we define inclusion? So we have a couple columns with what inclusion is not. As Janelle goes through, you can probably connect a little bit more here. A dump in hope is general education where that environment is not prepared. No one's prepared. The representation in the curriculum is not even there. Mine versus yours is that language that bifurcates the system. We talked about breaking down silos. It's equity and educational benefit. It's independence and interdependence that we just talked about. One question I have for you is what's the difference between an inclusive environment and mainstreaming? Because we use them synonymously and they are not the same. Anybody have a definition of mainstreaming? Yeah. Well,
I'm going to repeat it for the online community.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. The idea definition is like that students might be integrated in an environment, but it doesn't mean that they have community or yeah.
I love that you use the word integrated because integration and inclusion are also synonymous. Integration means that they're in that space. They're integrated into the space. Meaningful inclusion and rightful presence is that connection. Yes.
Yes.
Yep. You're a visitor. It's not home. Yeah, that's such a great analogy.
You want me to repeat it? Mainstreaming is more a student is a guest versus inclusion is a home. Very different.
It's presumption that all students can learn, not an assumption that some students can't. Okay. General ed with a one-on-one untrained aide. This is huge.
See, lots of head nods.
So the person that might have the deepest relationship with that student too often is untrained to understand the disability as it manifests specifically for that student and how to apply the accommodations. The other piece to this is, and this one just over the last year, I've had to grapple with a little bit, over accommodation is ableist. So you think about a one-on-one untrained aide who really wants to support the student deeply, actually is the barrier for students to experience failure, mistakes. It's called the dignity of risk. We deny the dignity of risk when we over accommodate. We have in one of our school districts up in El Dorado, our very first kindergartner with Down syndrome. And before the student arrived, the parents were like, she's coming, so school, get ready. The principal, the teachers thought the world was going to end. We don't have the resources, we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the funding, it's never going to work. She showed up and the world did not fall apart. The other students love her. The teachers love her. And she was playing on the playground and she fell off the box. And the principal was like, we'll remove the box. It's dangerous. And the parents were like, no, don't move the box, because now Gigi knows how close to get to the edge without falling off. She would not have learned through the dignity of risk that lesson.
By the way, this is a little tiny district with like one school. They're just building another one. And I think it just goes back again to that question earlier, if we are designing for just one student. But look at what having one student has done for their community. Their students, their teacher. We got to do a walkthrough of the campus. I mean, the level of joy that people are experiencing learning how to support one student and what that's doing to their practice is amazing.
Well, I want to take it back to the question from the back around credentialing. What's happening at UC Davis is that because the students in the Redwood Seed Scholars Program are out in other classrooms, those professors who are used to teaching in one way, they have had to expand their skill. They've become better professors because the students that are in the Redwood Seed Scholars Program are present. And because they're present, we have students in other majors who are changing their majors because of their experience. And the students that are like in the medical field, they are expanding their knowledge and their skill and their support.
Someone cut you off. It wasn't me. So also with the students Kevin's talking about who are the mentors, guess what? They're changing their majors. They now want to become educators, lawyers, policymakers, because they have had this experience that now they're like, and the reality is looking forward, someday they're going to sit on a hiring panel, possibly. And now they're not going to be afraid to hire someone with a disability because they know what to do. Okay, so meaningful inclusion, you really are cut off for a second because it's my turn. Meaningful inclusion is rooted, and so much of our work is centered around creating spaces of belonging. So forget about place, forget about all those other practices for a moment, and just focus on what does it mean to create environments where students truly feel a sense of belonging no matter where they are in community. So we use the TIE Center 10 dimensions of belonging to ground us in this work. There's a website here, you can go to it. It looks like this. Once you get on the left-hand side, you can click on the various 10 dimensions of belonging to further unpack and define what each of the dimensions means. But we just want you to know that belonging isn't just a nice sentiment or a word or a Hallmark greeting. Truly, we as human beings, we are hardwired to want to experience belonging. Just like our basic needs, belonging is one of them. We need food, we need water, we need to feel belonging. Think about a time in your life, whether it be your school experience or even your work experience, where you did feel that you belonged. And think about a time you did not feel you belonged there. How do those experiences differ for you? Okay, we're gonna give you about 2 minutes because we are behind, But we still want you to just have a little conversation with your table mates. And for those of you online, feel free to use the chat. Just take a look at these 10 dimensions of belonging. What does it mean to be present, invited, welcome, known, accepted, involved, supported, heard, befriended? What do you think is going well within your systems in terms of helping students feel a sense of belonging, and what could be improved? Just take about 2 minutes. I would love to hear from 1 or 2 people, what is going well in this area? What is going well? Where do we see examples of belonging? Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yes. So for the online community, we have a co-taught situation where it sounds like there's some co-teaching, and then there's some pull-out supports through SDC model, and students are making friends. Huge. Okay, let's take one more. Mm-hmm.
How can I be more supportive? They're reaching out on their own just because we've been starting with.
Yeah. Awesome. So we see teachers showing interest, investment, asking how. One more comment. Okay. So the example is through community engagement and extracurricular activities that connect Special Olympics and school. Yeah, and creating a community where you see like, wow, these are some great programs that now we can start to bridge. And it is really, really important. So Kevin and I huddled and we're like, we come in so hot sometimes with the like, these are all the things we need to do because we're really passionate about it. When we support districts, we support them in meeting them where they are. And so when you are going out and you are the ally for this work, it's really important to start with what is going well, what are our entry points, and let's now move from there.
And there's no one way. Like we get asked all the time, just tell us how to do inclusion. We can't do that. It doesn't work that way. Yeah. But really look at what plans do you have in place in your district? What are the resources? What are the priorities? What are the initiatives? And then how do you build from there through the alignment and the communication out that's clear on the vision of inclusion? And here's the part that's often forgotten is what are the accountability measures?
And who are your allies? So in the example of we have teachers coming together asking how, create a collective here and start there. Move with those allies. Okay, so we, in our project, we are doing some work with the Swift Center, Swift Education Center, National Center on Inclusion toward Rightful Presence. And really, this is leveling up inclusion. And the reason we want to bring this to you is because it also connects to what some people have already said about dismantling our systems and really moving into a space where we're thinking about this work through an equity lens, because it does sometimes require undoing. And what Rightful Presence, or what the National Center says, is we believe an environment that is conducive to learning and personal growth is established first and foremost through the cultivation of a culture of true belonging. So we start with creating environments of belonging, and efforts toward that goal must begin with the presumption of the rightful presence and inherent value of the disenfranchised. So again, our systems were built separate. Inclusion efforts alone cannot bring about substantial change because they still adhere to the same guest-host power dynamic that serves to normalize the existence of a group who's invited and a group who has the power to invite. So this goes back to some of our language too around mainstreaming. We don't want students to feel that they are a guest in a classroom. And so that comes back to our beliefs about educators and how we are approaching this work. So I'm not going to go through all of these for the sake of time, but I do want to invite you to come back to them because it is powerful. I'll talk about one and you can come back. But what the center has done is they've pulled together some research to say, this is what we as educators with the best of intentions, we think we're creating for students, but this is how students are actually experiencing it. So one example of, we think that we're creating caring and compassionate, or we are caring and compassionate educators inviting minoritized students into mainstreaming school cultures and academics, where what the student may be experiencing is caring and compassionate educators are the hosts who hold the power to invite or deny me as a guest. Okay, so my question to all of you is, with the best of intentions, we're creating these spaces, but what are students truly experiencing? And how do we know what they're experiencing? How often do we ask them about their experiences?
Before you move on, I just want to call out this idea, if you go back one, I just want to call out this idea of assimilation. This takes us back to identity, intersectionality work. Are we expecting students, in order to be included, we're actually expecting them to assimilate and deny part of their identity in order to be included? So inclusion sometimes requires students to assimilate in a way that creates hidden identities. In order for you to be included, you must act a certain way, be a certain way, learn a certain way. That's where the power dynamics and the social justice comes into play. And it's really difficult sometimes to understand the power dynamics in the guest host realm. And it's also the analogy of sanctuary cities. Sanctuary cities invite populations that are typically different. They invite them into a space, but is that space truly designed and honoring and representing their cultures? That's the analogy here, is whether or not the environment in which students are invited into are actually reflective of their needs in such a way they don't have to deny a part of who they are as a valued part of diversity in our world.
And it's important because we're hearing the disability community say, I don't want to mask who I am. I want to be who I am. I don't need to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with me. I am a person with a disability, and that is an identity that I am proud of. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When I do walk into our classes that are like FCC settings, right? It's only here are
Yeah.
right? Our older students, suffering that they have, right? Part of their LGBT, right?
Yeah.
Aspects of their identity, like this only focus on the disability that others are that make them.
Yeah.
Should I say the thing?
Say the thing.
So, because I feel like I'm in community, I just want you to ponder the statement. Disability is the only identity that we are explicitly okay with segregating.
Snaps.
We would never.
Snaps all around. Snaps all around.
Never, and the word explicit is important.
Mm-hmm.
We would never explicitly segregate based on race, gender, sexual orientation. However, qualify for an IEP and we're good to go.
And we're not saying that other identities are not excluded. However, it's the explicit outward, we are okay with it. Mm.
Yeah, it's a
I'm going to repeat for
thanks.
the
You know I can't do
community
that.
online. It's just that catch-22 that folks are experiencing where the educators are becoming, and parents becoming fearful of adding a label, because then that dictates future through that lens of having a label of a disability. And then the educators grappling with, but we want to make sure a student gets the appropriate supports and services.
Oh, I thought you were going to repeat the question.
Oh, I didn't know that was a question.
Or statement.
Oh, it was a statement, right? Oh, what do we do? Okay.
So super nuanced question. What do we do about the labeling and the label dictating the money? Is that right? Okay. So yes, and what in terms of labeling, yes, there is a label around disability. We also have to be really clear on whether or not that label is seen through a deficit, right? And that's where a lot of this conversation enters the picture. We also have to be really clear that, are we qualifying students for an IEP as a disability? Is it a true disability, or is it that the student hasn't fit into the one size fits all, which then gets us into the significant disproportionality in special ed? So we have to be really clear on kind of the systemic things that are happening. But there is no clear answer on the label and the connection to the money. I think it requires us to go back and really look at, are we labeling, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, are we labeling students inappropriately to get the funding? That's the other piece to it. And that's where also we get students into more segregated environments.
And are we in a system where the decision making then dictates program with that label? There are systems. I mean, there are many IEPs that if you took this to another state, that student would be fully included, no question. No question, right? So it's really addressing the mindsets and the practices and the policies or the processes within our system to make the appropriate decisions. We're like way behind on time, which is
Okay.
fine.
I can do this. I can do this quick.
I think we've like totally lost track.
She talks a lot and then she tells me we're short on time.
Uh-huh.
That's how this works.
You can see how this works.
All right. So really quickly, we just wanted to make sure that there was content around ableism, because it isn't a conversation that we have. And it's actually one of the questions that when we start talking about ableism, we usually get a hand raised. Do you explain what ableism actually is? So we just have a couple slides. If you just go through the slides, we wanted to make sure that you had a definition of ableism. So just give you a second. I'm not going to read it out loud, but it does go into that idea of a medical model of disability, that students with disabilities need to be fixed in order to participate, and the idea of whether or not it's within the student or within the environment. Okay, this is also part of the social justice piece that we talked about earlier. And then we wanted to make sure you had examples. As you look at all the bullet points, you probably experienced a number of these examples. Ableist non-affirming deficit language usage. Because ableism is so implicit and a part of just what we're used to, I think one of the quotes addressed injustices in the system become invisible because of their regularities. It's always the way that we've done it, right? So this idea of ableist language, really hard to identify. Ableist structures, ableist decisions, really hard to identify. Okay, so we have to understand what it is, and then we also have to call it out. This is also another framing people with disabilities as inspirational. There's a TED Talk by Stella Young. I don't know if you've seen it. It's so good. But it's I am not your inspiration. and she does it all from her wheelchair, and she just talks about, I got an award for getting out of bed in the morning. Like, doesn't make any sense, but so these are just some examples.
You also hear a big right now in the disability community saying, I don't want to be told that I have special needs. I have human needs, not special needs.
That's an interesting one because I had to have it explained, because as a former special education teacher, special needs is really what the term was that I used. Understanding that everyone has needs across different contexts. And by calling special needs out for individuals with disabilities is actually very othering to individuals with disabilities. Wouldn't have thought of that had I not known or had been in a relationship with someone with disability. And you've probably heard these quotes. So microaggressions are also a big part of this. Identifying microaggressions. Here's the difficulty, and I think it's on the next slide. Is that the resources? Oh, no.
It's way further.
Oh, it is? Okay. Go back one. I forgot where I was going with. Yeah, that one actually, it's triggering for some people. Can I pray for you? What's the message? Yeah, there's something wrong with you. Okay. So we also look at, if you go to the next. So this is the soft bigotry of low expectations. It's soft bigotry because it's implicit. And when we lower our expectations, students experience marginalization for whatever reason, and then there's a deficit view of that student. It could be a disability, it could be behavior, it could be social emotional, it could be they're part of the LGBT community. Lowered expectations of the student, they're labeled and placed in remedial learning, and that remedial learning perpetuates school failure into post-secondary opportunities. Students learn about themselves, their self-perception, and their place in the world in too often by the decisions that we make on how much access they have to their typically developing peers. Think about the power. Sitting in an IEP meeting and the team is determining the level of belonging, the level of connection that student, often at 5 years old, will experience. That is a huge amount of power that we hold. Yeah. Oh.
Like here we are, I'm trying to like, self-advocacy and what your disability is, because we have that for physician planning. And I have a mom who doesn't want her child to know that. And she's, I think, in denial that these are the things he can do, or what the potential is. So
yeah. Considering the parent perspective, that's why this work is so nuanced, because everyone's coming to it from a different mindset, a different perspective. And having conversations with parents early on that help them to understand the importance of students being in less restrictive environments. But as a parent, I would also want that comfortable, that environment where my child is experiencing belonging. It's scary for students to be in larger environments that may be rooted in ableism. It's a dance. But to have the conversations that there are opportunities based on what we talked about post-secondary, based on the disability not being a deficit, and based on the importance of students experiencing inclusion to some extent. It could be playground, and then how we're going to expand it. How are we going to help the student to develop the skills necessary to expand the inclusive opportunities so that they're more prepared? Side of that is, in our culture, what we don't talk about turns to shame.
And it really comes back to, so for the online community, to summarize it, it's understanding that as educators, as parents and students, we're all coming into these conversations from our own lived experiences that then impact our beliefs, that then impact our actions, right? And so, and in these conversations, we do have to target disrupting what our beliefs are from the educator perspective, from the student perspective, and to make sure that we're all aligned. So for online community, and I think we have like 1 more minute left, so we're just gonna end with Q&A. The question is, how do I approach it if I do want to have conversations about disability without outing a student with a disability? So there's a couple things. One, we need to start in classroom normalizing that we all have different needs, that we are creating equitable learning environments that are not centered around a one-size-fits-all approach, and that regardless of disability, we just have different learning needs, and we're going to honor that. And we all have different identities that we're going to honor and celebrate. That's first and foremost. Second is having open dialogue language without calling a person out, that disability is not a bad thing. It's a beautiful thing, and we all have something to contribute. And here's what a disability means, and here's what maybe unique characteristics are, and here's how we support each other in the community.
And you can normalize that through your curriculum. Those conversations, like go back at one of the districts that we work with, we were having these conversations, and there was a librarian in the room. She was like, I never considered buying my book list based on disabled authors and disabled characters in the books. The representation piece opened up the conversations around disability. But as Janelle said, really having the conversation that we all have needs across different contexts. And I'll be willing to bet there are general education students in your classrooms that require more support in certain contexts than your students on IEPs. Yeah. Yeah. If you could, can you just go to the language guide real quick?
Yeah.
That's a great video. Oh, this.
Yeah, we have great resources.
Oh, going. We want to make sure you have resources. So this is the Stanford Disability Language Guide, which gives you bullet points on kind of ableist perspectives, conversations that you can have, similar to what you were asking, and then words to use, words not to use. So it's just a really helpful guide to really look at how we utilize language. And then Janelle, over here, if you could go right there. So this is just an allyship continuum. It's an activity. We've created a Padlet that is all based on ableism and allyship. And then this is the RIR protocol that when you recognize ableism, ableist language, you have to recognize it, you have to interrupt it, and then you have to repair. And this gives you sentence stems on how to have those conversations so that you can continue moving forward, even though you've interrupted or disrupted ableist language. So go ahead.
Thanks for being here.